Have you ever wondered why some women seem to carry an invisible weight on their shoulders? Why they can sense the emotions of everyone around them, almost as if they're psychic? What if I told you that this extraordinary sensitivity often stems from childhood wounds that transformed them into something Carl Jung would recognize as profound healers? Today, we're diving deep into one of Jung's most transformative concepts: how the scapegoat child, particularly daughters, evolve into empathic seers. This isn't just psychology. It's a journey of alchemical transformation that turns pain into power, wounds into wisdom. Meet Sarah, a 35-year-old therapist who can walk into any room and immediately sense the underlying tensions, the unspoken grief, the hidden anger. Her friends call it a gift, but Sarah knows the truth. This ability was forged in the crucible of her childhood, where she learned to read every micro-expression on her mother's face, to anticipate her father's moods before they erupted, to become the family's emotional barometer, just to survive. Sarah's story isn't unique. Across cultures and generations, certain children, often daughters, are unconsciously selected by dysfunctional family systems to carry the emotional burden of the entire household. Jung understood this phenomenon deeply, recognizing that the child who becomes the family scapegoat is actually being initiated into a sacred role, though at a tremendous personal cost. The scapegoat child learns to absorb toxicity like a sponge absorbs water. She becomes hypervigilant, developing an almost supernatural ability to read between the lines, to sense what others are feeling even when they can't name it themselves. This child learns that her survival depends on emotional intelligence, on being the first to detect danger, the first to soothe conflict, the first to sacrifice her own needs for the family's emotional equilibrium. But here's what's truly remarkable. Jung saw this wounding as a form of shamanic initiation. In ancient cultures, the shaman was often someone who had been broken down by illness, trauma, or spiritual crisis, only to emerge with extraordinary healing abilities. The wounded child who becomes an empath follows this same archetypal pattern. If you're recognizing yourself in this description, if you're one of those women who feels everything so deeply it sometimes hurts, then this video is specifically for you. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we're about to explore how your deepest wounds might actually be your greatest gifts. The transformation from scapegoat to seer doesn't happen overnight. It's a process Jung called individuation, the journey toward wholeness that requires us to reclaim the parts of ourselves we sacrificed in childhood. For the empathic woman, this means learning to honor her sensitivity while establishing healthy boundaries. To understand how this transformation occurs, we need to explore Jung's concept of the wounded healer archetype. This ancient pattern appears in mythology worldwide, from Chiron, the wounded centaur who became the greatest healer in Greek mythology, to the biblical figure of Job, who emerged from suffering with profound wisdom. The scapegoat daughter embodies this archetype perfectly. She's the one who absorbs the family's shadow, all the emotions, traumas, and dysfunctions that others can't or won't face. In doing so, she develops what Jung called inferior function development. While her peers are learning to assert themselves, she's learning to disappear. While they're developing their own identities, she's becoming a mirror for everyone else's needs. Consider Maria's story. Growing up in a household with an alcoholic father and a chronically anxious mother, Maria became the family's emotional thermostat. At age 8, she was already mediating between her parents, comforting her younger siblings, and somehow maintaining perfect grades to avoid adding stress to the volatile household. She learned to read her father's footsteps, to determine his mood, to gauge her mother's breathing, to assess her anxiety level, to become invisible when tension peaked. This hypervigilance created what psychologists now recognize as complex PTSD, but it also gifted Maria with extraordinary emotional intelligence. She could sense a person's emotional state from across a room, could predict relationship problems before the couples themselves recognize them, could offer comfort in exactly the way each person needed it most. But here's the crucial insight Jung offers us. This wounding wasn't random. The child who becomes the family scapegoat often possesses what Jung termed archetypal sensitivity, a natural openness to the collective unconscious that makes them both vulnerable to psychic intrusion and capable of profound healing work. Jung believed that certain individuals are born with thinner boundaries between the conscious and unconscious mind. These children are naturally empathic, intuitive, and sensitive to energy. In a healthy family system, these gifts would be nurtured and protected. But in dysfunctional families, these very gifts make the child a target for projection and scapegoating. The sensitive child becomes the repository for all the family's unprocessed emotions. She carries not just her own pain, but generations of inherited trauma. Jung called this phenomenon participation mystique, an unconscious identification with others that dissolves normal ego boundaries. For the scapegoat child, this isn't a choice. It's a survival strategy that becomes a way of being in the world. The journey from scapegoat to seer begins with what Jung called the confrontation with the shadow. For empathic women, this means recognizing that their compulsive need to heal others often stems from their own unhealed wounds. It's a painful realization. The very sensitivity that makes them extraordinary healers can also become a prison of codependency and self-sacrifice. Let's look at Rebecca's awakening. At 42, Rebecca had built a successful career as a social worker, drawn naturally to helping the most damaged clients. Her colleagues marveled at her ability to reach people others had given up on. But Rebecca was burning out. She was absorbing so much pain from her clients that she couldn't sleep, couldn't maintain relationships, couldn't find joy in her own life. It was during therapy that Rebecca began to understand her pattern. She had never learned to differentiate between her emotions and others. Jung would say she was living in a state of psychic inflation, unconsciously identifying with the healer archetype to such a degree that she'd lost touch with her own needs, her own wounds, her own humanity. The shadow work began when Rebecca started to explore her childhood role as the family's emotional caretaker. She discovered that her compulsive need to rescue others was actually an attempt to rescue the wounded child within herself. Every client she healed was, unconsciously, an attempt to heal her own inner child who had never been protected, never been allowed to just be a child. This is where Jung's concept of enantiodromia becomes crucial, the principle that everything eventually transforms into its opposite. The wounded child who becomes overly responsible for others' emotions must learn to become responsibly selfish. The woman who has spent her life absorbing others' pain must learn to feel her own. The empath who has lived with porous boundaries must develop healthy selfishness. Jung understood that true healing requires what he called holding the tension of opposites. For the empathic woman, this means learning to be both sensitive and boundaried, both caring and self-protective, both open to others' pain and committed to her own healing. The transformation isn't about losing empathy. It's about developing what psychologists now call cognitive empathy, rather than emotional empathy. Instead of feeling others' emotions as if they were her own, the healing empath learns to understand others' emotions while maintaining her own emotional center. She becomes like a skilled therapist who can sit with someone's deepest pain without being overwhelmed by it. This shift requires what Jung called active imagination, the ability to dialogue with the wounded parts of herself. The scapegoat child within needs to be acknowledged, grieved, and ultimately integrated. Only then can the empathic woman step fully into her role as a conscious healer, rather than an unconscious emotional sponge. The emergence of the seer archetype represents what Jung considered the highest form of psychological development, the integration of wounded and healer, darkness and light, personal pain, and collective wisdom. The woman who has successfully navigated this transformation becomes what ancient cultures recognized as a wise woman, a medicine woman, a keeper of sacred knowledge. Take Elena's remarkable journey. After years of therapy and inner work, Elena began to understand that her childhood trauma had actually cracked her open to dimensions of reality that others couldn't perceive. Her ability to sense impending relationship problems wasn't just hypervigilance, it was genuine, intuitive wisdom. Her capacity to comfort others in their darkest moments wasn't just codependency, it was a sacred gift that had been forged in the fires of her own suffering. Jung believed that individuals who had undergone significant psychological wounding often developed what he called transcendent function, to bridge the conscious and unconscious realms. For empathic women, this manifests as an uncanny ability to see through social masks, to sense the deeper currents running beneath surface interactions, to perceive the archetypal patterns playing out in people's lives. Elena learned to trust these perceptions while maintaining healthy boundaries. She discovered that she could offer profound insights to others without taking on their emotional burdens. She developed what Jung termed differentiated consciousness, the ability to perceive multiple layers of reality simultaneously while remaining grounded in her own center. The seer understands that her sensitivity isn't a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be refined. She learns to work with energy rather than against it, to channel her empathic abilities in service of healing rather than self-destruction. She becomes what Jung called a wounded healer, someone whose own suffering has been transformed into wisdom that can guide others through similar passages. This transformation requires developing what Jung called the transcendent attitude, the ability to hold paradox without needing to resolve it immediately. The seer can simultaneously hold her own pain and others' pain, her vulnerability and her strength, her human limitations and her archetypal calling. She learns to navigate what Jung termed the tension between the personal and the collective, honoring her individual healing journey while serving something larger than herself. The seer also develops what ancient wisdom traditions called discernment, the ability to distinguish between her own emotions, others' projected emotions, and collective emotional currents. She learns to sense when someone is genuinely asking for help versus when they're attempting to make her responsible for their emotional regulation. She develops an internal compass that guides her toward situations where her gifts can be genuinely helpful, while steering her away from relationships that would exploit her sensitivity. Perhaps the most profound aspect of this transformation is what Jung called the return of the feminine principle. In patriarchal cultures, the feminine qualities of intuition, emotion, and interconnectedness have been systematically devalued. The scapegoat daughter often carries the wounded feminine not just for her family, but for the collective culture that has forgotten how to honor emotional wisdom. When she heals and integrates her gifts, she becomes a bridge between worlds, the rational and the intuitive, the individual and the collective, the mundane and the sacred. She embodies what Jung termed the anima mundi, the soul of the world, in her very being. Consider Diana's evolution. After decades of feeling like she was too much, too sensitive, too emotional, too aware of subtleties others missed, Diana began to understand that these qualities weren't flaws to be fixed, but sacred gifts to be honored. She learned to see her emotional sensitivity as a form of intelligence, her intuitive perceptions as valuable data, her capacity for deep feeling as a strength rather than a vulnerability. Diana discovered that her ability to sense the emotional undercurrents in groups made her an exceptional facilitator and mediator. Her capacity to feel others' pain deeply when properly boundaried made her a gifted healer and counselor. Her intuitive understanding of human nature, born from years of hypervigilance, gave her profound wisdom about relationships and human psychology. But perhaps most importantly, Diana learned what Jung called the art of conscious suffering. Instead of unconsciously absorbing others' pain, she learned to consciously choose when and how to engage with difficult emotions. She developed what he termed a differentiated relationship with suffering, understanding that not all pain needs to be immediately fixed or avoided, that some suffering serves a sacred purpose in the process of transformation. Jung believed that individuals who had integrated their wounded healer archetype became what he called culture carriers, people who hold and transmit essential wisdom for their communities. These women become the ones others instinctively turn to in times of crisis, not because they have all the answers, but because they can hold space for the questions, sit with uncertainty, and offer the kind of presence that allows others to find their own answers. If you're a woman who recognizes herself in this journey, remember that your sensitivity isn't a burden. It's a sacred calling. Your wounds weren't meaningless suffering. They were initiation into a profound form of service. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel because we'll be diving deeper into practical techniques for integrating these insights into your daily life, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. The final stage of this transformation involves what Jung called the realization of the self, the integration of all aspects of personality into a cohesive whole. For the woman who has journeyed from scapegoat to seer, this means embracing both her wounded child and her wise woman, her vulnerability and her strength, her human limitations and her archetypal gifts. This integration doesn't mean the wounds disappear. Rather, they become integrated into a larger story of meaning and purpose. The scars become sacred tattoos that mark the initiate's journey through the underworld and back to the light. What once felt like a curse is revealed to have been a calling all along. Jung understood that this type of transformation serves not just the individual, but the collective. The woman who has integrated her empathic gifts becomes what he called a function of the collective unconscious, a living bridge between the wounded and the whole, between those who suffer and those who can heal, between the darkness that everyone carries and the light that everyone seeks. These women often find themselves in roles that didn't exist when they were children: energy healers, intuitive coaches, trauma therapists, spiritual guides. They create new forms of healing that blend ancient wisdom with modern understanding, that honor both the scientific and the sacred, that recognize both the individual and the collective dimensions of healing. The journey from scapegoat to seer isn't just a personal transformation, it's a cultural evolution. As more women reclaim their sensitivity as strength, as they learn to honor their emotional intelligence and intuitive wisdom, they're literally changing the consciousness of our planet. They're bringing back what Jung called the lost feminine, not as weakness, but as a form of power that our world desperately needs. Your sensitivity was never your weakness. Your ability to feel deeply was never your flaw. Your wounds were never meaningless. They were all part of a sacred initiation that has prepared you to serve in ways that only someone who has walked through the darkness and found the light can serve. The world needs empathic seers now more than ever. It needs women who can feel the collective pain without being overwhelmed by it, who can offer healing without sacrificing themselves, who can hold space for transformation without trying to control it. If you're one of these women, know that your journey from scapegoat to seer isn't just your healing. It's a gift to the world. Remember, the wounded healer doesn't heal despite her wounds. She heals because of them. And in healing herself, she heals the world.